Okay, so now we are going to talk about Pompeii. We're going to step out of linear time for a moment. So I told you about the Roman Republic and architecture and sculpture related to that, and we'll get into the early empire next. But I'm just going to take a little caveat here, and we're going to learn a little bit about Pompeii, and from that we're going to learn about city structure, and we're also going to learn about typical Roman homes and their layout. And then in the second lecture after this, we're going to learn about Roman painting styles. And then we'll get back into the linear kind of chronology of these lectures and go back to the early empire. So right now we're just going to look at some kind of overview stuff. Okay, Pompeii. You've probably heard of Pompeii. A lot of people have. So on August 24th, 79 CE, Mount Vesuvius erupts. So today, if you look at a map of Italy, Vesuvius is very near Naples, which is near Pompeii also. So there's a mountain called Vesuvius. It turns out it's a volcano. It erupts. Lots of people die. It also preserves a lot in volcanic ash. So a lot of this is very well preserved. Give you a little history of Pompeii. So it was populated by the Oscas and then the Samnites, and then there's this thing that's called the Ally War or the Social War. Pompey loses, and then Sulla, who was the consul of the Roman Republic at the time, founds a new Roman colony in Pompeii. So Pompeii then becomes part of the Roman Empire. Okay? So Pliny the Elder, who I've mentioned before, he's a historian who wrote a book called Natural History. And it was really an important record of Greek culture, and he also wrote about early Roman culture. He is at Pompeii when Pompeii erupts. And he could have escaped, but he runs back in because he was trying to save people. He was trying to rescue people and get them out to the boats to escape. But he becomes overcome by fumes from the volcano and he dies. Also with him was Pliny the Younger, who was his nephew. And he lives, and he is on a boat watching this happen. And so his uncle dies, and he sees this huge disaster happen. And so he writes an account of what happened at Pompeii. So we have very detailed historical first-person accounts of what's going on. It's a horrible tragedy. One of the things about Pompeii that is interesting is because everything was covered in volcanic lava and ash and everything, it's almost like a time capsule. So it's preserved this layout of a Roman city and all the homes and all the buildings and things within it. And there weren't any modern things built up around, so it's perfectly preserved, like a little time capsule. So it's a horrible tragedy, but from an art historical and architectural historical perspective, it's a resource that shows us a lot about what life was like and how things were designed and laid out at this time. Okay, so in your typical Roman city, you have a forum, and the forum is kind of the center of the city. So it's generally laid out. Now this doesn't apply to Rome, the city, because all of the emperors, not all, but most of the emperors decide they need their own forums, and so they're no longer the center of the city because they had to fit all of them in. But typically, the forum for a Roman city like Pompeii is the center of the city, and it's literally at the intersection of the Cardo, that is a street that runs north to south, and the Decumanus, which is an avenue that runs east to west. Here's a fun fact for you. In your hometown, if you're one of my students, you're probably in Springfield, Missouri, start thinking about what roads in town are called streets and what are called avenues. You'll see that all of the streets run north-south and all of the avenues run east to west. And I bet you haven't noticed that before. That goes all the way back to ancient Rome. That is an ancient Roman thing that we still do in contemporary society, which is kind of cool. Okay, so the forum is at the intersection of these major roads. It's kind of the city center. This one is quite typical. So we can see, get an idea of what Roman cities in general were kind of like. We have a two-story colonnade on three sides of the long, narrow piazza, the plaza, which is kind of the center of the forum, the civic forum. So this is a big open space where people can gather. We have generally a temple. In this case, there's the Temple of Jupiter. There's also the Capitolium, which is a shrine to Jupiter, Minerva, and Juno. I'll go into that a little bit more in a second. We have a basilica. Now, basilicas, later when we get into like early medieval, Romanesque, Gothic, basilica becomes a typical plan for churches and especially cathedrals. In Roman times, basilica was an administrative building, kind of like a town hall almost, like a big open room where you could come and address the administrators, the people who ran your city. It's also where the law court was held. So very important kind of civic building, and it generally is on the forum. It's set up with a nave, an open central area with two aisles running up and down the sides. Okay, so let's look a little closer at some of these things. If you go to Pompeii, you can walk around in Pompeii in the city ruins. It's pretty interesting. So this is what the forum looks like today, what's left of it. The north end has the Temple of Jupiter, which is in ruins now, but we can get a pretty good idea of what it looked like. So it's built by the Samnites in the 2nd century, and then when Pompeii becomes a Roman colony, it's converted into not just a temple to Jupiter, but a shrine to multiple people, so to Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva. So that's Jupiter is Zeus, Juno is Hera, Minerva is Athena, okay? This is, again, what we saw in the architecture of the Republic. This is a Etruscan plan layout where we have it's closed on three sides in the back. The only open place with open full columns is the porch or the pronaos in the front. You can only enter from the front. So we have Ionic capitals, or excuse me, no, Corinthian capitals. So Corinthian order like the Greeks, like the classical architecture of the Greeks, but on an Etruscan plan. Okay, another thing that the Romans invent is they take the Greek idea of a theater, which remember comes from the word theatron, which is literally means scene place, and they alter it. So they create a amphitheater. Ampha, A-M-P-H-I, means double. So like if you think of like an amphibian is an animal with a double nature. It can go on land or in the water. Okay, so an amphitheater is a double theater. It's like two theaters put together. This one is very large. It was funded by two town officials, Quintius Valgus and Marcus Porcius. And it's the earliest amphitheater known that could seat 20,000 people, so it's huge. Basically, the different areas have specific names. So the seating area, like where you sit in the stadium part, is called the cavea, and it's made entirely out of concrete. That's structurally how it's able to be made. You'll notice it also has all these arches, which had barrel vaults running under the seating to support it, so that's structurally how it's able to be created. So the cavea, that's where you sit, and then the middle part where the gladiator battles and performances and stuff happened is called the arena. That's the central stage. It's called the arena. And the word arena is actually a Latin word for a very particular kind of sand that was very good for soaking up blood. Ooh, so kind of gruesome. So the next time you think about a sporting arena, know that that is where the word arena comes from, okay? Because the Romans liked to have these bloody gladiator fights and things for their entertainment. So it was named after a sand that's good at soaking up blood. So there you go. Okay, the amphitheater is in pretty good shape, as you can see. It's entirely constructed out of concrete, still standing in fairly pristine condition today. This is a fresco painting in Pompeii of their amphitheater. And specifically, it's of an event that happened at their amphitheater where there was a brawl. So there was a big fight between the Pompeians and their neighbors who were called the Nucerians. They had like a event where their gladiators were battling each other, And just like when the Kansas City Chiefs play the Raiders and there's fights that break out, same kind of thing. Big fight breaks out, there's a brawl, and post-brawl, the city of Pompeii closed their amphitheater for an entire decade to punish the citizenry for acting barbarically, in their words, which is kind of wild. We know from this illustration that there was a retractable cloth that would have gone over the top to create shade, and that's called a velarium. So that is something that we only know is only evidenced by paintings at the time. You can also see like little vendors and people had their things set up around, so it's kind of an interesting portrayal. Okay, the last thing we're going to talk about in this lecture before we go on to talk about painting styles is the layout of a typical Roman house. So this is a pretty typical design. The word for house is domus. The narrow foyer where you walk in is called a fossus. That is the Latin word for jaws, which walking into the house is walking into the jaws. That's kind of crazy. And we have an atrium, which is a central reception area. In the courtyard, there's an open air courtyard in each house. There's a basin called an impluvium, which is where it would capture rainwater, and then you'd have water in your house to use. Impluvium, PLU, is in there. So that's if you've taken French, which is a Romance language, so it's based on Latin. Plu, il fait plu means rain, so this is the impluvium is where you catch the rain. The cubicula are the bedrooms, which is a little tricky because it kind of looks like the word for cubicle, which is more of something we associate with offices, but cubicula are bedrooms. The alae are these recessed areas kind of in the back, and this is like the Latin word for wings. The tablinum is your home office. The triclinia is the dining room. Oftentimes there'd be an outdoor and an indoor dining room. The peristyle is the framed garden area. That's kind of the courtyard is the peristyle. Okay, so this is a typical layout of a Roman house. And then let's look inside this one. This is the house of the Veti. This is a little bit fancier of a Roman house. The Veti were brothers. It's a family that lived here were brothers. Aulus Vettius Restitutus and Aulus Vettius Conviva, and they were freed slaves who became merchants and were able to own this really fantastic house. It has lots of fresco paintings. It was very lavish, and you can just see a slightly different, a larger scale kind of variation on the typical Roman house, but you can see how everything was laid out. Okay, so next we will talk about the 4 styles of Roman painting.